Good morning and welcome to this video on literary theory. This is going to be an introduction to the idea of the literary canon, which is something that I've referred to in my other videos on literary theory, on feminism, Marxism and post-colonialism. But I thought it was an idea to look at the literary canon in a little bit more depth here. Thinking about the canon then and the idea of literary value, I suppose the first question I have to ask you is, as a student of English literature, what should I read? And this is a question that lots of students ask me, particularly in the summer between finishing year 11 and moving on to their A-levels, or finishing their A-levels and moving on to university. You know, they've got a bit of time and they want some reading recommendations. Well, I suppose, thinking back to the kind of books that I've studied and that I was taught at university, I can come up with what is probably seems like quite a long list, but might be quite a short list, really, in the scale of things, of books that you should read. So we've got Homer's The Iliad, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. Certainly when I teach tragedy at A-level, we refer to that novel, or that play, sorry, quite a lot. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, whether in the original or in translation. Shakespeare, just everything, but particularly the tragedies. John Donne's Holy Sonnets are very good. John Milton's Paradise Lost is a bit of a heavy read, a long read that one, but definitely worth it. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe, anything by the Bronte sisters, Wordsworth The Prelude, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, not my favourite, but it's definitely there on the list of books that people should read. Great Expectations by Dickens, again, not my favourite, but if you want a book that's going to help you to access lots of different things on literature courses, then that's one to go for. Personally, I would actually go for Bleak House. Middlemarch by George Eliot, Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, Henry James' The Portrait of a Lady, another one that's a bit of a challenge to read, but again, it's worth it. Moby Dick by Herman Melville, so moving over to America with these ones. Back in Europe, Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. This is another one that's on our A-level course. Ulysses by James Joyce. Again, a bit of a challenge, a very long challenge, but worth it. And Virginia Woolf by Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. A brilliant book, absolutely love it. The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. And I suppose looking at this list of texts, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, why are these books all on this list? Why are these books taught at university, in schools? Why, when someone asks for a book recommendation, are these the kind of things that spring to mind? Oh, there's Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot there as well. And this is, I suppose, the foundation of the concept of the literary canon. We ask ourselves questions: why choose to foreground these authors and not others? And why are these texts deemed to have some kind of universal value, whilst other texts aren't? Why are these texts considered to be timeless when they are so clearly tied up in their particular historical context? And if you think about Shakespeare's tragedies, for example, why is Antony and Cleopatra's tragic death, their suicide at the end of the play, why is that a kind of timeless event when actually it's bound up within the culture, the politics, the history, the gender situation of the time? And who chose this list of texts? Where did this list come from? And what were the motivations, the preconceptions, the assumptions that lay behind these choices? And why choose these texts and exclude other texts? On what grounds has that decision been made? Well, this is, I suppose, what we call a literary canon. It's a group of texts that people over a couple of centuries seem to have agreed that everybody should read, and particularly students of literature should read. Now, many literary critics have challenged this canon, this list of texts, often from a Marxist, a post-colonialist, a feminist perspective, because they believe that it represents the value system of the privileged elite. So in other words, the value system of white men. And if you look back at that list that I had on the previous slide, the thing that a lot of those writers have in common is that they're white. So they're coming from that colonial perspective in a lot of cases. A lot of those writers are men, or in the Victorian period, they're women who used male pseudonyms. So George Eliot and the Bronte sisters used male pseudonyms in order to be taken more seriously. And a lot of these writers are also dead. So dead white men is the phrase that we often use to describe the type of people who are in the literary canon. So the canon is a group of texts that have been judged to meet a particular standard and are therefore deemed worthy of study or representative of their time. Etymologically, our understanding of canon is derived from the Greek canon, which means a rod or a bar or a standard of excellence. And in Latin, canon came to mean church law or a rule or a doctrine. And we also talk about the canon of biblical books as well, the 66 books that we have in the Bible. So the idea of canon is really caught up with value judgments, with ideas of what good literature should look like, and that modal verb should is really important in that sentence. But in the kind of linguistic association with the church as well, there's a sense of almost morality or, dare I say it, kind of divinity to do with these books as well. And a lot of critics have decided that they want to defend the canon against these Marxist, feminist, post-colonialists who are trying to challenge it. And the foremost of these is called Harold Bloom. Now, Bloom is an American literary critic. He was a professor at Yale University. And he defended the concept of the literary canon and the ability for a group of academics, so people who are experts in this field, to judge literary value. Now, he referred to those who were challenging the canon as the school of resentment, and by that he meant people like the feminists, the Marxists, the post-colonialists, the dodgy people who are challenging the power structures. And Bloom's ideas were centred on what he termed the anxiety of influence. So this means that writers are inspired by previous writers, but are anxious to avoid repeating what has gone before. So they need to create something unique and new, even if their ideas were originally founded on their own reading. And I'm sure you've experienced this yourself when you've been doing your own creative writing at GCSE and possibly A-level too. You know, you're taking inspiration from things that have gone before, but you don't want to just kind of rehash old ideas. You want to do something new, something original. And if we think about the kind of books that are out there at the minute, we might consider the Victorian novelist George Gissing. Now, Gissing critiques society in much the same way as Dickens, and Dickens was writing slightly earlier than Gissing. Gissing was slightly later in the Victorian period, and Gissing had definitely read Dickens. But Gissing's new addition to canonical literature is to add greater realistic depth to his depiction of the sufferings of the working classes. So Dickens definitely portrays that suffering, the difficulties that people go through. But in Gissing, it's much more profound, it's much more continual. There's less use of comedy to kind of lighten the mood every so often. And so in Gissing's novels, we get that exact same critique, but actually the depth and the breadth of that critique is much, much greater than in Dickens. And so Harold Bloom used this idea to judge writers who were successful or not successful. So if a writer was merely derivative of his predecessors, he was not successful, whereas a successful writer was able to draw on influences and use them to create something new. And then in 1994, Bloom published a very important study called the Western Canon, and this is an analysis of 26 major literary works that he believed were central to the canon. And he believed that these political readings, such as feminism, had little to do with literature, with the text itself. He thought that these readings couldn't enlighten us any further about the actual text and told us more about the politics of the day than they did about the literature. In response to Bloom and to other critics like Bloom, a lot of people have challenged the canon then, have tried to explore why the canon should be exploded or destroyed or gotten rid of or changed in some way. And from the 1960s onwards, this was based around feminists, Marxist, post-colonialist critics and others who challenged the canon on the basis that it was mostly written and selected by dead white men. So in this argument, the canon is used to reinforce the ideology of those in power. So from a feminist perspective, that would be the patriarchy, or from a post-colonialist perspective, it would be the colonizers, or your Marxists would be looking at the upper classes. And people wanted to challenge the idea that there was some kind of gold standard of aesthetic beauty, you know, some kind of ideal of beauty. And what these critics then challenged was that, or they said that this idea was mistaken, because really beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You know, for example, a representation of a woman in a text might be described by some critics to be extremely beautiful, but actually from a female perspective you might think, but that's not the reality. You know, it may be aesthetically beautiful, the words that are chosen, the language devices that are being used may be very accomplished, but actually does it communicate anything about the reality of being a woman within a patriarchal society? So why is it that aesthetic beauty could be chosen above the communication of a real experience? Or are they both real experiences? And so this politically engaged group of critics essentially saw the canon as being a symbol of power. So then they ask, what would a truly diverse understanding of literature and literary value look like? So for example, why is post-colonialism post-colonialism? So who was writing from a subaltern perspective during colonisation? So we've got lots of writers in the 20th century who have written about colonial experiences. You know, if you think of Chinua Achebe, for example, or if you look at the Satanic Verses, or if you think of Toni Morrison, but they were all writing after the colonialist project arguably had ended. But who was writing during that time? And I suppose we could look at a novel like The Untouchables would be someone who had a novel that has recently been added to the canon. And can we reclaim more of such writings? Would they be good examples of literature? And what would they tell us about society, culture, what life was really like under colonialism or living in the patriarchy, or as a working class person in the capitalist world? There are a number of problems with this, of course, as there are with everything. And I suppose the big question here is, what should feminist, Marxists, post-colonialists aim for when they challenge the canon? Should they be aiming for the inclusion of a wider range of text in the canon? But there are so many problems with this. Does this implicitly signal agreement with the idea that we can come up with a definitive list of literary achievement? So does it just continue to perpetuate the idea that some people are better than others, some writing is better than others, and therefore it's just another form of limitation on what we should read? And how do we decide which texts are diverse enough to be included in this expanded canon? And on what criteria are we making this judgment? So all of this really comes down to the idea, does it simply perpetuate the problem of judgments being made by a powerful, educated elite, even if that elite is enlightened in a political sense? So for example, Toni Morrison's novels of the late 20th century are now canonical, but we could really look in and explore, why is that? Why are her books accepted but other people's aren't? Therefore, should we just dispense with the canon? Should we just get rid of it? And ideologically, for some people, the answer may be yes. But then this leaves a problem. So for education, we have to choose a limited selection of texts. We only have a limited time period, and the exam board has to choose texts that students are going to be able to study, the resources are there for, and that they can examine. Similarly with university, they've only got 3 years to do an undergraduate course. What are people going to study in that course? So the mission of getting rid of the canon therefore seems impossible, because it's almost human nature to categorise things and to create lists of things and to limit things. And that's to do with time limitations as well, in terms of the length of the courses that you'll be studying. What might an interpretation from this perspective look like then? Well, I've taken the example here of J.M. Coetzee's novella, Foe, which really challenges the literary canon. So Foe was published in 1986. It's a radical rewriting of Daniel Defoe's canonical text, Robinson Crusoe, which is often considered to be the first novel in English, and it was published in 1719. So the placement of Robinson Crusoe within the canon reveals and perpetuates the privileging of white, male colonial voice. The narrative itself tells the story of the Englishman Crusoe, who is shipwrecked on a distant island. And on this island, he encounters a group of cannibals. When one of their prisoners escapes, Crusoe welcomes him and calls him Friday. And then Crusoe and Friday live on the island. They try to create almost a little mini civilization, a way of existence, and then they try to escape from the island as well. Now, Foe takes this story, and particularly the character of Friday, and tries to rewrite him. In Robinson Crusoe, Friday doesn't have a voice within that text, very much like Bertha, the character of Bertha within Jane Eyre, who then becomes Antoinette in Wide Sargasso Sea. So Friday is voiceless, and in Foe that's represented by the fact that he's had his tongue cut out. And this is a symbol for the silencing within Defoe's novel, and more broadly speaking, of the silencing of subaltern peoples within the colonial world. And Coetzee presents Friday's inability to speak as representative of his lack of power and his subservience to his white master. So thus, Coetzee highlights the marginalisation of ethnic groups within the literary canon. It's perhaps not just that we don't include books by people who aren't dead white men, but perhaps the structures of power have prevented those books from being written in the first place, so maybe they aren't actually there to be included. And then Coetzee depicts the struggle for these marginalised groups to find a voice. So in his version of the story, Friday is taken by a character called Susan Barton, who attempts to teach him to write and therefore overcome his silence. However, she's frustrated in this. And there's another interesting example in the text of Friday attempting to communicate, I suppose, or attempting to express himself. And he does this through flute playing. And Susan Barton tries to play her flute as well, but what she finds is that the different sounds don't combine together, that there's no way of their music joining together in harmony. And so what we see here is that unlike Wide Sargasso Sea, in which the mistreated woman Antoinette, or Bertha from Jane Eyre, is successfully given a voice, Foe seems to indicate that this endeavour is not possible. So even if Friday were to learn to write, the very act of writing in English would not signal his liberation, but actually his entrapment within yet another form of oppression. And if we think about writing in the English language, the type of words, the type of vocabulary could be interpreted as a form of oppression in itself. If you think about this from a feminist angle particularly, think about the different words that are used to describe men and women and the connotations of those different words. So for example, if a woman commits adultery, or she's unloyal to her husband, you might call her a series of words, and I'm sure you can think of what those words might mean. But if a man was unfaithful to someone, then he might be regarded as being a player, and there's an inherent sexism in the difference between the use of those terms, that in a sense men are shown to have a bit more power, a bit more liberation, whereas women, if they attempt to take that power, that liberation, then they're called a series of kind of sexist slurs and insults. And so I suppose what Coetzee is saying is that to bring Friday, to bring that subaltern person into the English language and into the written text, is to bring him into a language which itself is just completely marked by oppression. And so Coetzee really kind of questions that project, whereas with Wide Sargasso Sea, what we see is that actually giving Antoinette a voice is actually, from the perspective of that novel, it is actually a successful way of articulating female experience in a patriarchal world. Okay, so I suppose what this video is trying to get you to do is to ask questions about the text that you are reading. So I'm not saying don't read the list of novels that I put at the start of the PowerPoint here. In fact, I would encourage you to go away and read them, and to read lots of other canonical and non-canonical texts as well. But it's really for you to interrogate what you're reading and think about what value it has, why does it have that value, what assumptions are made in the writing of the text, and then also how we interpret the text, and what are the different ways that you could interpret that text for yourself. So thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.